conservative, constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
And welcome, everybody, to another wonderful day here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. I hope everybody's having a fantastic Friday. Now, earlier this week, I talked about what Russell Coleman has done since he's in office, Attorney General. One of the big things he's done is really taking aims at suing Biden. Biden wants to stop coal. Well, at least the Biden EPA. I don't think Biden himself knows anything about what's going on, but the Biden EPA wants coal to stop majorly. And they're doing this by increasing the cost of using coal in your coal-fired power plants. And, you know, for those of you who listen to the show for like a while, and by a while I mean all through this last legislative session, you may have heard me mention a few times about how there was a big debate going on in the legislature because they were setting up a new regulatory body that would have that was heavily influenced by coal to be over the public utility regulatory body that, you know, currently when a power company comes in and they want to ask to shut down a power plant, they actually have to ask permission from the state government to shut down that plant, replace it with something else. And a big part of the reasoning why, and I know a lot of you are like, well, you know, is that the free market? Is it not? But a big part of the power regulatory structure is the fact that these power companies have a monopoly that's enforced by the government because they entered into agreements about using the lines, and in return the power companies put up the lines, and then that created these monopolies long time ago. And so therefore the power companies get heavily regulated because they're using these power lines. They repair these power lines, take care of these power lines. They technically own the power lines, but the government doesn't allow anybody else to run power lines, so you can't actually get a free market competition. Everybody's kind of locked in because, well, you know, you'd have, 10 different companies' power lines running all over the place, and then government itself didn't want to come in and build the power lines and maintain them. And so that's why they are so heavily regulated by government. And so the Public Utility Regulatory Body has to ask permission here in Kentucky if they want to shut down one of their power plants, gas-powered, coal-powered, what have you. And obviously a lot of politics go into it. And during this last governor's election, we saw a fair amount of politics when LG&E wanted to shut down, I believe, 2 coal-fired power plants. And during the campaign, between Beshear and Cameron, they did not make that announcement that they would be shutting down those coal-fired power plants. Instead, they waited until almost the day after, or I believe it was the day after, the general election in November 2023 to announce they are going to allow LG&E to shut down those 2 coal-fired plants, because obviously that's a very political thing. And so the bodies become very politically charged, but one of the things that they're pushed with doing as well is making sure that the ratepayers, so, you know, the customers of the power company, pay as little as they're supposed to, basically, that it's the lowest rate they can offer. There's a lot of permission asking that goes on in raising rates. And because the Biden administration has been making coal so expensive to burn, coal is actually a very cheap power source. The problem is the EPA has been making it so expensive to operate a power plant using coal, because I was talking about this with a group of people here this week. And what's so diabolical about the plans that Biden's putting forward is it's not just that they create inflation accidentally. They're doing it on purpose. So for green energy reasons, they want you using green energy items like solar and wind. But solar and wind actually isn't that cheap. It's actually kind of expensive. Part of the reason why it's so expensive, of course, is because, one, it doesn't always generate enough power, and so those states end up having to buy power from other places and kind of pipe it in, and that gets more expensive because now you're entering into the power exchange, of course. But there's a huge number of reasons why, but essentially wind and solar is just not as cheap as coal. Natural gas as well. Not as cheap as coal in a lot of situations. And so the Biden administration is coming in and saying, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead, because of our green agenda, we're going to make it so expensive to burn coal that now using coal is more expensive than using things like solar and wind. And so rather than lowering the cost of solar and wind down through innovation and everything else, they've decided instead they're going to get involved and fiddle around in the free markets by raising the cost of doing business by increasing the cost of burning coal. And in response to this, Kentucky puts in this regulatory body over top of this utility body in order to go ahead and try to put in place more of the protection of coal jobs as well, because part of the thing about coal is that obviously there's a large industry in eastern western Kentucky that is based around coal. Those are coal regions, and as coal continues to move out, those economies in those areas are going to just be so massively damaged as they have been ever since the Clean Air Act in the 1990s, and it's just really hit them pretty hard. But on top of that, this week we had Kentucky Living, which I do believe is published by the Kentucky Electric Cooperatives. So take this with a grain of salt, but they come in with gambling with the grid. And they say the U.S. is phasing out reliable energy sources just when we need them the most. It's a high-stakes gamble with American energy futures on the line. Like a poker player pushing all his chips into the center of the table, the Biden administration and several states are going all in on renewable energy, betting that technology will catch up by the time the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's pending zero-emission mandates would effectively shut down coal power plants 11 years from now. But hold all bets. The independent authority overseeing electric reliability in North America is issuing a warning. According to the North American Electrical Reliability Corporation, the threat of rolling blackouts is increasing across the country as fossil fuel power plants are prematurely retired and replacement energy sources aren't capable of filling the gap. It goes on to point out that on top of the fact that you have rolling blackouts now, Kentucky Living is saying that according to the NERC, the demand for electricity will grow by 10% through year 2032, but electric generation to meet that demand is projected to grow by only 4%. And so obviously this phase out in order to go to coal, away from coal into renewables, is going to hurt Kentucky a lot. Not only does it hurt Kentucky coal jobs, an obvious thing, but also Kentucky is not particularly well set up for a large amount of the renewables. You know, when you go out west, and you know, I recently drove out west to South Dakota, check out Mount Rushmore, and on the way out there, driving or coming back, long drive, like 20-hour drive, on the way back though, you see these wind turbines everywhere. They are just everywhere, but they are flat and the wind doesn't get stopped by a lot of things. The problem in Kentucky is there's not as many places to put up the wind turbines. Sure, you can put them out in Western Kentucky and other places, but you're also using up now farmland to go ahead and do that. And on top of that, you need an awful lot of wind turbines to be able to power everything. And the big problem with renewables that people really don't want to discuss, and what the real issue here is the storage. While a wind turbine may produce enough power, technically speaking, for 500 to 1,000 houses throughout the year, the issue is that it only generates that when it's blowing. And if the wind blows too fast, you have to stop the turbine from spinning. And of course, if it's blowing too slow that day, if it just so happens that day the wind's blowing slower and then the next day the wind's blowing faster, well, when the wind's blowing slower, you still need to provide the same amount of energy as you did when the wind was blowing faster, and we don't have an efficient way of storing it. You see, coal is storing power in the coal, and then it's available on demand because you can just throw it in there. You can just throw more coal into a burner and fire up another furnace to go ahead and heat the water to spin the turbines, right? And so that energy storage is truly the big problem here. And so Kentucky doesn't have as much energy access as a lot of these other places do. We kind of need coal, not just for the jobs, but, and natural gas. We don't have that infrastructure in place. And so the point is that the demands on our grid are going to skyrocket, but our legislature, while recognizing that, is making moves and made moves this last session to make the demand on our grid grow even more. What have they done? We'll go over that after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. For the break, I was talking about how energy demand will increase, is increasing across the country, will increase in Kentucky, of course, too, as well. Just naturally would increase. While the Biden administration is putting in place these rules that are causing Kentucky's power is certainly to be affected because coal, they don't want you burning coal. They've made it clear, and they want a zero emissions power system within the next 11 years. And the Kentucky cooperatives are warning that this will cause more rolling blackouts as we've seen less and less energy reliability over the last several years. And as people switch to more renewables, well, they're not as reliable. And so the legislature acknowledges that by setting up a regulatory body to try to kind of keep coal in place due to its reliability, hoping to as well we don't shut down coal power plants now that we end up needing, or once Trump gets into office too as well, as if he does, assuming he does, he can reverse a lot of those policies. And now it's like, okay, you're shutting down this coal fire plant, but now coal is the cheapest because we're not artificially increasing the prices. So you have all that in mind, okay, and the demand rising. But despite that, our legislature is pushing forward policies that make no sense when it comes to both our policy, our electric generation problems, as well as just general economic development. You know, one thing I brought up several months ago, but it was in the revenue bill that the legislature passed, was a special tax incentive for a data center. They said, we want a data center in Louisville. So as long as a data center comes in, that's like, a big server farm, comes in and invests at least $450 million in capital, we will give them a 50-year sales tax exemption, sales and use tax exemption, meaning for 50 years, anything that this data center purchases, they do not have to pay the 6% sales tax on. A massive tax incentive. And the question becomes, why are you doing this, right? And for comparison, so you understand, and those of you say, well, that's economic development. They're doing it for the jobs. For comparison, a $800 million data center put up by Facebook, Meta, went in across the river over in Clark County, Indiana, went in, and it only employed 100 employees. Do you have any idea how much a sales and use tax exemption will cost over 50 years? For an example, I mean, they're coming in, they're building a $450 million facility. This is going to be a $1 billion company. So a $1 billion company here in Kentucky only spends $10 million a year in sales taxable items here, just spending $10 million. That is $600K a year. And it's literally like the only money you make off a data center. As I stated, 800 million equals 100 jobs. That's it. So to say, well, they bring in jobs and we make money off the jobs and local government makes money off the jobs, there's really not a lot of jobs coming in for this. The only money you do make off them is property tax and sales and use tax. But you're giving them a pass. And they don't even bring in other industry with them. It's just a data center that gets built. Nothing else needs to come in with. There's no auxiliary. At least if you make the argument about Blue Oval getting so much money or the battery plants getting so much money, you say, well, there'll be all these auxiliary factories that have to come into the area now that don't get the tax incentives that these other groups got. And so we'll be able to make a lot of money off them too. And so we're making money off the factory, or we'll break even on Blue Oval, let's say, over the course of 20, 30 years because of the $500 million we gave them to build that battery plant. So we'll break even over time, or it'll take a certain amount of time. But because of all those auxiliary factories they bring in, that brings in more jobs that don't get the tax benefits that we will go ahead and be able to pocket the cash on. But data centers don't even bring that. They don't bring auxiliary companies with them. And you're missing out on like $600,000 a year in sales and use tax. That's a huge incentive. On top of this, they're coming in, they started doing crypto incentives and handouts too. So we're getting into a more questionable future when it comes to energy consumption. Coal's getting pushed off of our allowance to be used on the grid. Meanwhile, you're literally giving tax handouts and incentives to bring in power-heavy companies like data centers, like crypto mining centers. They burn a lot of power. So you're incentivizing them to come into Kentucky to increase our power demands at a time that the Biden administration's trying to make our power less reliable. I mean, power availability at a good rate is going to become a real good problem. Not to mention you're now incentivizing these companies to come in. And look, if they were coming in on their own, I would have no problem with it. I'd be like, look, it's a free market. They decided to come in. The power companies adapt, whatever. I'm not saying we should artificially stop growth and deny businesses coming in because we're like, well, you're going to burn too much power and the people can't handle that. So, I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is at least we could not incentivize it. Not incentivize companies to come in, burn a lot of power, and bring no jobs, and also they're not going to generate any tax revenues because we gave them massive exemptions. It doesn't make any sense at all. None of the. It's like they're sitting around in a room throwing darts at a dartboard, deciding what to hand out incentives to next. I mean, it's like battery plants over here, indoor growing app harvest, indoor greenhouses. We'll throw it at that. What's that? Data centers? Yeah, shoot, let's throw it there. Sure, that sounds good. What else can we incentivize to come into the company, into the state here? I mean, there's no, that's the thing that drives me crazy. All these people talk about, economic development. Andrew, you're just against economic development. I mean, I'm against government literally taking money from the citizens, just handing it out to, private companies making billions of dollars a year. I think that's kind of ridiculous, especially when you have such low unemployment and you have more jobs open than you have people looking for jobs. So yeah, I have that issue, but even if you're for economic development, you'd like to see some rhyme or reason that falls in line with the surplus of resources we have and the areas we need the jobs in places that make sense to companies that are stable and make sense and aren't new ventures. You love to see it, but that's not quite what we'll get. Well, an interesting committee went on this week. So the interim committee started up in the legislature. So that is there's in between sessions, right? So our sessions last, for lack of, I'm not going to go into super detail, but our sessions basically last from January till April, mid-April-ish, around there. And so our sessions last till then, and between them from January to April, so from April to January, they have what's called interim joint committees. And I was watching the budget review subcommittee on the Justice and Judiciary, mainly because the Department of Juvenile Justice was coming in to testify. And that's a really interesting thing here. And there was something that caught my eye. We're going to go into the actual committee hearing, but before I do, there is something that caught my attention about the committee. Let me play for you the very beginning of this committee meeting.
This time we'll have the secretary call the roll.
Senator Nemes, Senator Schickel, Senator Webb, Representative Brown, Representative Decker, Representative Kulkarni,
Present.
Representative Sharp, Senator Mays-Bledsoe, Senator McDaniel, Representative Bowling, Representative Bray, Representative Petrie, Representative Elliott, Co-Chair Funky Fromeyer,
Present.
and Chair Flannery.
Here. I do not believe we have a quorum, but being the first meeting, we do not have any minutes to approve. So
your ears don't deceive you. I do believe that was 6 people who showed up to this meeting. 6 people who showed up to this committee meeting. 6 legislators, 6 people paid by your tax dollars that showed up to this meeting out of the 15 that are part of the committee. 6 people out of 15. They didn't even have enough people to call it a quorum. So if they did have to take a vote on approving the last meeting's minutes or anything else, they wouldn't be able to do that. This is a pretty important meeting. I'll go over why. But 6 out of 15 show up. And why is it so important that they show up to the Department of Juvenile Justice? Why? Well, I don't know. Maybe it's because the Department of Juvenile Justice is having huge amounts of issues. They have things like misuse of restraints. You had issues of juvenile boys breaking into the juvenile girls' floor while rioting and raping a female prisoner at a juvenile justice center because they were housing them together during a riot with guards locked in the guards' rooms because they couldn't come out because they didn't have enough people to subdue the riots. You have literal situations in the female prisons of women being left naked in rooms for like days, apparently. All kinds of issues, so much so that they're under federal investigation. There's a pending federal investigation into this department. Let's keep in mind that Bashir's a Democrat. Biden's a Democrat. So you know it must be pretty bad if the federal Democrat-run government is willing to come in and get involved in this investigation into another Democrat. And they're up here to testify, and we can only get 6 out of 15 of our legislators up there. 6 out of 15 of them bothered to show up to hear from a department of our government that's under federal investigation because of how poorly run it is. That's been through, I don't even know how many heads at this point. Putting all that aside, let's go over what they said after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show. For the break, I was kind of introducing you to this committee hearing where only 6 out of 15 legislators bothered to show up to, where the Department of Juvenile Justice, one of the most problem-filled departments. The head of it, Randy White, is here testifying about what he's experienced, what's going on in the department. And he starts off with an interesting comment. We're actually going to revisit this comment a few times because I think it shapes into why our justice system is so broken. Why is crime increasing outside of the obvious, outside external things, but even on the things government really can control, like justice? It points to why we're continuing to have so many issues, especially too with our youth, as this is talking about our juvenile justice system. But I want to start with this first comment from Randy White. Take a listen.
All of this to say, after 27 years of serving in corrections and having interactions with juveniles as they were transferred from detention to prison, I can honestly say that juveniles entering the criminal justice system are a different population than they were 27 years ago. They're committing harsher crimes, which require stronger rehabilitative efforts. For Kentucky to truly reduce the juvenile population, we must focus our efforts on alternatives to detention. Education, programming, employment, and mental health.
So I want you to remember the comment he just made, okay? We'll probably I'll actually probably have to play that for you again just to remind you. Okay, so because it's interesting here. He's saying kids have gotten more violent over time. Even he says this is completely different kids than what I was dealing with. All the times I've been involved with justice system and juvenile justice, and it's been a long time. I spared you his resume, but it's lengthy. And he says these are completely different kids than what I've dealt with. But our response to this needs not be to return to the policies of the time where we didn't have these problems. No, we don't need to lock them up and deal with criminals like they're criminals. I mean, I don't know how often these people end up making these mental health claims about recidivism and all these. We need more mental health and these things about, recidivism and more rehabilitation and mental health. That's the problem. I mean, we know, especially with youth, what the actual problem is that there aren't parents who are involved. You have no fathers in the homes. The parents kind of feel separated from the kids. I mean, especially take Louisville, take these other places where you have heavy like Hispanic populations, heavy populations of parents that don't speak English, but their kids do. And think about the level of disconnect. Even if they wanted to raise children who fall in line and are doing what they're supposed to do, the level of disconnect that they can't get clear communication about what their kids are doing. I mean, I can't imagine how easy it would be for their children to lie to them, and for the parents to feel excluded, and for the kids to think, well, the parents just don't understand what's going on. They can't even speak the language. Like, that becomes an issue with language barriers. But also we have a crossover of what jails are for. I think we've lost that too, though. It's a juvenile justice centers, meaning the victims of these crimes deserve and are seeking justice. These are punishment centers. The idea and the bringing in of rehabilitation centers, and we need to help, blah, blah, blah. That's not, but those should be two different departments. I don't know how many times I say this, but having judges and our justice system be concerned about rehabilitation is like asking a person to ride two bikes. Either they can be concerned about justice or they can be concerned about rehabilitation, but you're giving them both to ride and they can't ride either. And most importantly, too, you can't get rid of the justice bike and just have the rehabilitation bike, because that ain't going to work either, because you do need the stick before you have the carrot. And the justice system is the stick. It's supposed to be. And so we're asking judges to be experts in mental health and drug treatment and all these things. We're asking our prisons to not be justice centers, but be rehabilitation centers concerned about mental health treatments and everything else, instead of saying these need to be two different groups. Judges are just worried about justice. Justice centers, juvenile justice detention centers need to be worried about getting justice for the families and the victims of that person's crime by fulfilling the aspects of the punishment. Then, if you want to spend money on it, and I think it would probably be smart in the long run, you can have a rehabilitation group that is completely separate from the justice system and separate from the judges. It should be an optional thing. Do you want to take part in rehabilitation or don't you? These are services available to you. If you want to take part in it, take part in it. But instead, we have judges and prisons thinking their job is rehabilitation, and so they end up not sentencing people to punish them for their crimes, but to somehow fix them in society. And when you have people, and you heard it from Randy, who says the kids are worse than they've ever been, and our response needs to be not to lock them up, but to take it easy on them, well, you're going to have issues. Have a rehabilitation system. Have it. Make it optional. I say make it optional because you can take a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. But when you make deals of, okay, you don't have to take justice if you'll take rehabilitation, even the most hardened criminals are going to say, yeah, I'll take rehabilitation. Sure, sounds easier. But they don't end up rehabilitated because they didn't actually get punished. And you know who's worse off too is the victims of the crimes. Do they not deserve justice in this? And as evidence, we're not holding youth accountable for violations of the law, and it's leading to a bigger issue. Randy White makes a very, very telling remark here. Let's take a listen.
Over the past decade, the juvenile justice detention center population has changed, resulting in a decrease in non-felony charges and an increase in felony charges. This is driven in part by Senate Bill 200's implementation in 2014. In short, Senate Bill 200 successfully diverted juveniles with lower level offenses. This leaves a larger proportion of youth in detention and higher level offenses.
So he says that Senate Bill 200 in 2014 led to more youth being diverted, and he characterizes this in the testimony as an effective and a success. Now, there's some numbers here, okay? Right? Well, first, let me go over what it did, okay? So, Senate Bill 200, it moves something called the status offenses or lesser offenses of youth, and it allowed them to not be held accountable for being put in detention for those quote-unquote crimes. And status crimes are things like truancy, running away from home, skipping school. All these things, they're considered crimes for adults, but they're crimes for kids. They're marked away as uncontrollable behavior, basically. And at the time, Kentucky was incarcerating children on those types of status offenses. There was this grand idea that this is a bad idea, that we shouldn't be throwing kids in jail for running away from school, for staying out too late, for not showing up to school, so on and so forth. And which is an interesting concept, because in a way, those status offenses are kind of stepping in for an out-of-control kid. They're kind of stepping in for a bad parent. It's the closest the government's going to get to parenting a child, and stepping in and saying, look, your kid's way out of control. We got to tamp this down. We got to deal with this. But also, too, it becomes an issue like when you're talking about especially things like curfews and running away. Like, we know that those kids are out there most likely, almost 100% of the time, involved in other types of behaviors like drugs, like theft, like other crimes that they're committing, trespassing, just a long list of crimes that they're committing because they have no way to necessarily, one, provide for themselves, and two, they're not out working because they can't legally work during those times. So it's not like they're doing honest work. So just think about it. What are kids doing when they're not at school, when they're out too late? What do you think they're up to? And so it's kind of a way to head off the worst offenders of that, to say, look, before you become just a downright criminal, we're going to try to intercede here. And so rather than incarcerating them, though, they said, let's go ahead and divert them. Well, what were the results of that? How did that play into it? What did the people at the time say about it? Well, we will have that after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And you're back here in this final segment of the Andrew Cooperrider Show on a wonderful, wonderful Friday. Before the break, I was talking about this hearing involving Randy White, Department of Juvenile Justice, is head guy there. And he was talking about how in 2014, the implementation of Senate Bill 200, he said there was a big success in diverting more youth away from the status crimes, which I went over in the prior segment, things like running away, truancy, saying, let's not send kids to jail on those crimes. Let's instead give them diversion, and this will be successful. This will be great. In fact, here, let me read an article from At the Time, because I think this is really important, okay? This is an article from At the Time called Reform Takes Aim at Kentucky Youth Incarceration by Mike Wynn. It was published back on April 24th, 2014. Troubled children who skip school or run away from home will receive diversion programs rather than jail time under sweeping reforms that will take effect next year in Kentucky. The state has ranked high nationally in recent years for incarcerating children on status offenses, infractions that aren't considered crimes for adults, such as truancy, running away, or uncontrollable behavior. Youth jail admissions on status offenses totaled around 1,125 in Kentucky last year. But lawmakers, officials, and advocacy groups behind the reform say they intend to curtail those numbers by keeping juveniles at home, in the classroom, and out of the criminal pipeline. They're also moving away from incarcerating children for minor crimes. Remember that too, incarcerating them for minor crimes, all at a projected savings of $24 million for the state over the next 5 years. This could be the most fundamental reform for kids in Kentucky since 1990 with the Kentucky Educational Reform Act, said Terry Brooks, executive director of Kentucky Youth Advocates. I think it's that deep and that broad. Senate Judiciary Chairman Whitney Westerfield said that it will mark a sea change in the state's approach to juvenile justice. For some kids, you need to have a softer touch. Instead of just locking them up and putting them in the environment, perhaps what they need is a mentor. The shift results from Senate Bill 200, a measure sponsored by Westerfield and based on 2-year review of state policies. It passed with bipartisan support in the final days of the 2014 General Assembly. So prior to the bill's implementation, we'll go to those comments, these rosy comments. This is just amazing. Well, this is going to be great. This is going to curtail everything, right? It's going to fix our problems. Sometimes kids just need a softer touch. They just need a mentor, right? That's what Whitney says. Okay, here's another quote. Westerfield and Tilley argued that the diversion process ultimately forces parents to become more involved rather than leaving a child's supervision to teachers or the court system. I want to remind you of one of Randy's comments. I said I was going to revisit it. I'm going to replay his comment because I think it's, now that you're hearing what they're saying. So Randy says that 2014, when they passed Senate Bill 200, it's a resounding success. It's diverted all these kids. I mean, it's an amazing success. It's really helped. And remember at the time they said this will divert the crime. The diversion process ultimately forces parents to become more involved. They need a softer touch instead of this intervention. That's how they're going to get on the right path. Let's return to Randy White's comments that he started off with.
All of this to say, after 27 years of serving in corrections and having interactions with juveniles as they were transferred from detention to prison, I can honestly say that juveniles entering the criminal justice system are a different population than they were 27 years ago. They're committing harsher crimes, which require stronger rehabilitative efforts.
The kids are different, not to the positive, to the negative. He says that the crimes they're committing are harsher. Randy says, look, the jail is full of the most violent kids I have ever seen in my time of being involved in justice system. Nothing like this I've seen before. So that's not just his feelings though. What do the numbers say? Was it successful? Outside of Randy's comments that the kids are more violent, let's go to the stats. Was it successful? Well, before the bill, there's 1,125 status offenses. And last year, there was about 1,400. That's a 24.4% increase over the last 9 years. Now, of course, population increased over that time. But do you think it increased by 25% nearly? Of course not. It increased by maybe 4 or 5%. So you see an almost 20% increase over unexplained. Well, we're explaining it. But 20% increase that's just hard to pin down. You got Randy White over here saying these are the most violent kids I've ever seen. We have nothing but violent offenders now. And we're stretched thin too. He says the resources are stretched thin. And for all of well, let's not have justice in the justice system, how it should be. Things will get better. We'll divert them. Well, you have more offenders offending in the category you diverted, the status offenses. You have a 25% increase almost over the last 10 years. And then you've also seen an explosion of violent crime in prison. So you put in place a policy directly related to youth crime, and the result is you've been seeing more youth crime and more violent youth crime. And all that evidence, in face of all that evidence, Randy still calls Senate Bill 200 a success. And then he says, we need more mental health. We need lighter touch. We need more parental. We need all these things. The justice system can't be the justice system beating the same drum that they were 9 years ago. And I feel bad for these kids with trash parents. I really do. And we need to address that. But we don't fix it by throwing mental health resources at kids while letting them off easy, because you know who really loses there? The victims do. And you know who else is losing according to the data? The kids are. In all your compassion, you have cruelty. Cruelty to the victims, one. Cruelty to the would-be victims, because instead of having criminal kids treated the way they have been for the last years, you're letting them off easy, which is creating more victims down the road because they're not learning their lesson. Nobody talks about that. Does this actually reduce recidivism? Because for every percentage point or 2 or 3, or in this case 25 almost, that crime goes up as a result of what we're doing, those are 25% more potential victims. As I said, you're trying to get somebody to ride 2 bikes at the same time. And they can't do either well. One group needs to worry about justice, and another needs to worry about reformation and rehabilitation, because they need the fire. They need the fire under them. They need the stick. They need to know there's a punishment out there for when you do wrong, but we're going to rehabilitate you after that punishment so you learn your lesson. You don't try to, and we know this as parents too, when you have a child that you're punishing, whether you're putting them in the corner or whether you're putting them in a room or whether you believe in corporal punishment or whatever it may be, it doesn't matter. What we know intrinsically is you punish the kid, then afterwards you explain it to them. You don't try to explain it to them while you're punishing them. They need the stick. They need the punishment. It's simple human psychology. But yet, it's like you're spanking a kid while also at the same time telling them how much you love them and don't want to do this and trying to teach them a lesson. If you're okay with spanking, if that's your thing. If that's not your thing, it's like a kid being put in the corner and you're leaning down in his ear telling him about how, you don't want to do this and you hope he learns his lesson. That's not what you do. You punish, then you issue the rehabilitation instruction. Now, do any of these sponsors apologize for what this bill has done? That's actually hurt the youth more in Kentucky? That's damaged them more? It's created more victims of youth crime in Kentucky and more violent child offenders? Do they address that at all? No. In fact, Whitney Westerfield, the sponsor of the bill this year, when crime bills were coming down to deal with violent offenders, he said, this quote from the floor, "Long after I'm gone, we're going to be paying for it, figuratively and literally." His entire crusade has been letting criminals out onto the street and trying to be a bleeding heart for these criminals. And he's passed bills on it, and everything's gotten worse, and he doesn't look in a mirror and take responsibility that he screwed up. It's because your government hates law-abiding people. That's all I can come to. They hate law-abiding people. There's actually more said during this committee hearing. Well, I'll have to hit a little bit on that. On Monday, you're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We'll see you Monday. Remember, you can tune in on WBNA 21. Till then, we'll be seeing you.